¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia, de esta parte de ciclos de conferencias que estamos realizando con diferentes ponentes internacionales y particularmente aterrizadas en campos afines entre la filosofía y el psicoanálisis. Contamos a principios de mes con Alex Taik Wang Li platicando con nosotros, y en esta ocasión se encontrará con nosotros la doctora Olga Vinogradova. Le damos la más cordial bienvenida. Antes la presento. Olga Vinogradova es profesora de la Primera Universidad Médica, Sechenov, y es profesor de la Primera Universidad Médica Estatal de Moscú. Ella es asistente de investigación en el Instituto Poletayev de Estudios Teóricos e Históricos en Humanidades, también en Moscú, y es autora de artículos científicos y capítulos de libros en diferentes idiomas: ruso, inglés y francés. Hace disertaciones en ambos idiomas, en inglés y en francés, sobre filosofía política y ética, y ha salido con honores bajo estas disertaciones, y las cuales se han llevado bajo la dirección de Pierre-Henri Taibolet en la Universidad de París, en la Sorbona. Actualmente se encuentra terminando un trabajo de tesis sobre el tema, la teoría del progreso del espíritu humano, en Nicolas de Condorcet. Las áreas de interés incluyen ética, filosofía de la ilustración, bioética, transhumanismo, teoría del progreso y filosofía de la historia. Bueno, sin más, le damos la más cordial bienvenida a la doctora Olga y esperamos que esta transmisión sea de su interés.
Hi, dear Alejandro. Thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to say one word. I'm not yet a doctor, but I'm a PhD candidate. I'm just trying to finish my thesis working on the concept of transhumanism and progress of Nicolas de Condorcet. Thank you very much for that possibility to enter and to say several words about my topic in your great channel. Thank you. So we can start if you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Olga. Thank you very much, and we'll listen to you.
Thank you. Could I ask to make a first slide of my presentation?
Of course.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for this channel again, that I have a possibility to talk here. Everybody knows that in Russia we have now a very complicated situation. And the topic of my talk today is Nicolas de Condorcet, Theory of Progress of the Human Mind. It will be the speech about the progress and faith in humanity and their capacity to improve. However, for the beginning, I would like to start my speech by saying that sometimes scientific and technological progress, where there is no moral and ethical component, where there is no faith in and respect for human dignity, with this technical progress can have catastrophic consequences. The war which was started by President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, I would like to say that that war is not my name or in name of my children and my compatriots. I would like you to know that Russians don't want war. We all are hostages in that situation of person who wants to maintain his power by any means and at the cost of their lives of thousands of people. For me, it's important to state here that I'm against the war, that the Ukrainian people are not my enemies, and that I will do everything in my power to stop it. Also, I would like to apologize that I will have to read my speech, not all of it, but the most part, because of that complicated situation. I want to save my thought. I want to save my mind in the direct line. So that's why, and I believe in that, right now for us, it's very important not to forget that human life is important. It's priceless. That there are eternal and saving concepts of human dignity, human reason, perfectibility, progress, love for people, and well-being and happiness. So that's why it's important to talk about philosophy like that for now. I would like to start my speech about one such philosopher who lived in even darker times, the times of French Revolution and terror in the end of 18th century. And he believed at that time, that scared, awful times, he believed that good, beneficent, and noble power of progresses exist. I will be talking about the Nicolas de Condorcet and his philosophy of perfectibility. So could I ask to change the slide? Thank you. Nicolas de Condorcet, he was a French philosopher, as I said, also mathematician, physicist, astronomer, economist, encyclopedist, and statesman. Next slide, please. Thank you. He became interested. First, I will talk about his biography a bit. For us, it's important to understand his evolution of his meaning, evolution of his works. So he became interested in mathematics in early age, and at 16, he successfully defended his thesis on mathematical analysis. Then he was elected in 1769. He was elected in French Academy of Science because of his mathematical achievements. Later in his life, he was a member of the Academies of Science in Berlin, Turin, Bologna, Philadelphia, and also St. Petersburg. Since 1770, he has created 23 articles on mathematics for the French Encyclopedia. You know, it's one of the most important point of thoughts of science at that period in France. Also, he was a secretary of the French Academy of Science, and he was academician of the French Academy. Then he started his political career because he wasn't satisfied just being a scientist. He started in being a special commission of National Assembly, and at the time he approved the meter at the Universal National Unit of Standard of the System of Measures and Weights. For example, we have to say thank you for meter for Condorcet. Could you please change the slide? Thank you. Condorcet presented the so-called Girondin draft of the Constitution, which was rejected by the National Convention. That draft contained the Declaration of Rights, which affirmed the basic natural, political, and civil rights of members of society, proclaimed the unity and indivisibility of the French Republic. It delegated executive power to a council of 7 ministers directly elected by people, guaranteed the right of social support and universal free primary education, and also abolished the death penalty execution. Criticizing the constitution adopted by convention, Jacobin Constitution, Condorcet signed his own death warrant. The Montagnards immediately voted for the arrest of the politician. He was put on the wanted list and he was forced to hide for 9 months in the house of the widow of the sculptor Vernet. Here he created one of his main works, sketch of a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, published just after the death of philosopher. Could you please change the slide? Thank you. In March 1794, Condorcet was arrested, and then next day he was found dead in a prison cell. To date, the burial place of the philosopher is unknown, but since 1989, his cenotaph has been in the French Pantheon. Next slide, please. Here we can see a very small list of his works. Of course, he was very productive. He worked and he wrote a lot. The sketch, which we will talk about, the first point here, that work is full of faith in the liberating power of the human mind, optimism about prospects for the social progress of society, as well as ability of man and society to improve endlessly. Next slide, please. Thank you. In the sketch, Condorcet sets out his own philosophy of the history of mankind. He invented a new point in a philosophy of history, which goes through various stages of development of its formation, where each of the next stage has more and more opportunities for the development of reason, for scientific and social progress, as well as for freedom and equality than the previous one. Thus, the next stages accumulate all the achievements of the earliest ones, inherit each other, and lay the foundation for the stage of the future. The whole history of civilization for him appeals in the form of 10 stages, where, starting from the first hundreds of years of human existence, human intellectual activity becomes the main driving force of progress. That is one of the most important points. So that our brain, that our reason, that our mind can drive the progress of humanity. So Condorcet's sketch is called also the Testament of the Enlightenment and a real philosophical hymn of progress. The next slide, please. And now we are talking about perfectibility. It's one of the most important notions of, okay, thank you. The one of the most important notions of his sketch, and I would like to say that it will be the basis of all his philosophy. Next slide. But for him, he was not the first one who invented this word, who invented that notion. The first one was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's a French philosopher, also a philosopher of Enlightenment. Of course, he was more famous than Condorcet, and he created many important concepts also. But when he created this notion of perfectibility, he gave to it another sense, another negative sense. So how he created this word? He took the word sociability, in French it's sociabilité, which was meaning the ability to live in society as opposed to the natural state of individuals, and the word perfection. So perfection plus sociability, and he created perfectibility. If there were not ability to self-improvement, he says, the human being would forever remain in his natural state of the noble savage. Thanks to this ability, individuals learned to contemplate, to be resilient, agile, and provident. It's precisely perfectibility and the ability to act freely that are the main qualities that distinguish human beings from animals. It's one of the most things that changes and that can distinguish us people, human beings, from animals. Next slide, please. Thank you. Also, he provided a rather negative assessment of perfectibility. He was talking that that word, that notion, it has a negative meaning. Because for him, it is this distinctive and almost unlimited faculty is the source of all human misfortunes. All human bads, they came from perfectibility for him. That is this which in time draws man out of his original state, in which he would have spent his days insensibly in peace and innocence. That is this faculty which successfully producing in different ages his discoveries and his errors, his vices and his virtues, makes him at length a tyrann both over himself and over nature. So it's a tyranny, the question of tyranny. Rousseau connects the development and improvement of the human mind with the formation of new requirements. But at the same time, those requirements contribute to elaborate destructive human needs and passions. As a consequence, if in a state of nature and individual has only physiological needs and fears, for example, for Rousseau, physiological needs, it's a fear of being hungry or suffering from pain, then perfectibility came, and that perfectibility should lead to the improvement of human nature, practically puts him back to the animal state. And a consequence of perfectibility that Rousseau defines and criticizes is imbecility, due to which a person returns to the psychology of the animal. First, we can say it distinguishes us from animals, but the second point, sometimes it puts us back. In other words, opposing animal instinct, perfectibility is more empty of content than this. It's neither invention for reflection nor reflection. It's not reason nor a freedom. It's only the normal condition that makes all these faculties possible. So it's a bit for Rousseau, it's a bit neutral notion, because it doesn't have a big negative color. So it's something which gives you a free will. That possibility can give you a free will and a will and possibility to act like you want. Next slide, please. Inspired by discourse of Rousseau, Condorcet took this notion, took this concept, but he invented it, he changed it. So he asks the following questions. Does the progress of the science and arts menace the happiness of mankind in any way? And could progress, for example, cause an increase of social inequality, despotism, and tyranny? Next slide, please. Thank you. The purpose of his work, of his sketch, was to show from reasoning and from facts that there is no limit has been set to how much the human faculties can improve, that the perfectibility of man really is indefinite, that the advances in this perfectibility from now on, they'll rise above every power that would block them, have no limit except the duration on the planet that nature has placed us on. Next slide, please. Relying upon Rousseau, Condorcet emphasized that it is not all perfectibility that provokes social inequality, absolutely not. The difference between the rights of people and inequality in society is due, in his opinion, to three fundamental reasons. The first, inequality of wealth, inequality of status between someone whose means of subsistence are secure for himself and will be inherited by his family, and someone whose resources depend on the length of his life, or rather on the part of his life in which he can work. And lastly, inequality of education. Thus, for Condorcet, historical progress is directly related to the improvement of the abilities of people united in society. This approach allows not only to trace the stage of the development of civilization in the past, but also, it's important, by highlighting the general laws governing the development of the moral and intellectual abilities of a person, to predict the development of mankind in the future. So, knowing the processes of perfectibility, of processes of persons psychologically, persons' utilization of that notion, we can predict the development of person and human society and mankind in the future. The next slide, please. Thank you. Condorcet is talking about the main characteristics of perfectibility. First, all these causes of the improvement of the human species. All this means that ensure it must from their very nature accept an always active influence and continually broaden the scope. Its main consequences will be of progress. The main consequences of living with perfectibility will be the truth, virtue, and happiness of individuals and of society as a whole. So in which the direct result of progress is to bring the common interest in each individual closer to the common interest of all. We can see here the main three characteristics are infinity, absence of limits, and permanent increase. The next slide, please. In his doctrine, in his thought, Condorcet defines two directions of the boundless improvement of humanity. First, the physical improvement, and second, it's a moral or intellectual improvement. In moral improvement, development, it includes the progress of the human mind, improving the quality of education, eliminating inequalities, and deleting prejudice. Physical enhancement involves amelioration of the quality of life, for example, and a constant increase in life expectancy. Perfectibility justifies the real progress of human mind, which is based on three social institutions. The next slide, please. Three social institutions we can see here: the education system, the legal system, and system of science and art. At thoughts and at Condorcet works, it was combined into a practical system of progress, the purpose of which was to eliminate all types of inequality in society and then to form a happy and prosperous society. So you can see here it's all of that parts, perfectibility of science, of public education, theory of law, they are connected, they are linked. And all of them, they also linked with the freedom and reason as an attributes of individual, amour propre. And the end and the aim of that, all that three main points of that system, it was a progress of humanity. It was not only an aim, but also an instrument. Progress is like a history. As I told, he was a philosopher of history, and history like a progress. One of the most important part which he was talking about is independence of reason, independence of mind. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about it, we can ask the question, what for? What for there is a perfectibility? What for there is all that progress and education and everything? And here he writes the answer. Our hopes, he says, for the future state of mankind come down to 3 points. First, the destruction of the inequality among nations. Second, advanced inequality within individual nations. And the third one, the real improvement of mankind. We will talk about it, about real improvement a bit later also. Next slide, please. Here we can see again the system of his meaning, the system of his knowledge. And next slide, please. One of the most important parts, I can say that the first part of that, his theory and his system was a public education theory or public education system. Condorcet wrote several projects, and he presented it in his in national convention. He proposed a real project of reformation of education system in France. If you know, before there were no in France a real education system, just many schools, but all schools were religious. So he wanted to invent a new education system, and he proposed his project. First, 5 notes. Could you please, next slide, give me? Thank you. 5 notes on public education and report on the organization of public education, which is different, for example, between Condorcet and other philosophers of the time. He was not talking only about the theory. He had a real practical meaning. He had a real practical concepts, how to realize his philosophy, how to give us a real progress for how to bring it in our life. So it was absolutely practical drafts of laws. And in his project, the education system, could you please give me the next slide? Thank you. So in his project, the education system looks like a real 5-stage pyramid. At the base, there is an elementary school, you can see, that provides basic education. Then it's a secondary school where subjects are studied deeper. Students are prepared to master professions. Then institutions that directly teach professions. And after, lyceums, where they become scientists. And in the top of the pyramid, it's an independent national society of science and arts, responsible for the supervision and control of the educational process. So we can see now it looks like a real our system of education, for example, in Russia or in France. Many years later, his concept was taken to France, and his concept was now it works like that. Now our educational systems really works like that. Elementary schools, secondary schools, institutions, lyceums, maybe they called another way, but. And also there was an interesting part about independent National Society of Science and Arts. What it gives to us. Independent National Society doesn't have to make a report to a government. It can create an educational program, educational subjects, without order or without asking the government. So independent system, if we are talking about Condorcet, independent system creates independent citizens, independent thinking. And people, and also interesting point that not all students have to go to lyceums or institutions. You could stop your education in any level you want, elementary school, secondary school, and only the most talented persons, students went to lyceums and became scientists. So it's a real meritocracy. The main goal of that system is not so much to educate and inform as to enlighten and cultivate personality, to develop intellectual, moral qualities and natural talents and abilities in an individual, and thus to contribute to the general continuous improvement of the human species and of the human mind. The following arguments point to the strong link between education and progress. We can see it. First, the idea of the continuity of generation, because education makes a person a part of the great whole and a partner of eternal work. Because each next generation inherits from the previous one ability to receive knowledge and to benefit from it. Thus, education becomes the main element in the concept of the endless improvement of the human race. His second argument is that education aimed at progress participates directly in the democratization of knowledge, available to men and women, that's interesting, from all parts of society. He was the first one who was talking about it, men and women. Free education should, first of all, form a class of experts from among the educated citizen on the Republic who will be able to choose best political leaders and manage the entire political process in the country. However, it's not a limit. Then he saw that generalization of public education should lead to direct democracy and the self-regulating society without government organizations. Where all decisions are made collectively and citizens have sufficient complete for this. So you can see, we independently educate persons, then they become smart citizens, and then they could make a smart choice. For example, they could make a smart choice and find a good statesman, vote for them, and also they can, when they vote for good statesmen, they took good laws, and good laws may give us possibility to develop our society and our science and our art. So all his system was full and was absolutely linked. All parts were linked with each other. But he was not, as I said, he was very criticized by his theory, because of his theory. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm sorry, here we couldn't see the last part of slides. I will tell you. So one of the first opponents of Condorcet theory of progress was the English economist Thomas Malthus. Maybe I'm sure you heard his name because of the notion of Malthusian trap. Malthus, 4 years after the first publication of Sketch of Condorcet, published his essay on the principle of population. And the whole name is essay on the principle of population, as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks of the speculations of Mr. Godwin, Monsieur Condorcet, and other writers. We can see that those titles already indicates the polemical nature of his work. The main thesis of Malthus was that the population in the earth increases with a force far exceeding the ability of the earth to produce means of subsistence. Population of the planet is growing in geometric rate, he told, and the means of subsistence are multiplying in arithmetic rate. He thought that the right movement to capture the prevailing mood of England, because of course we can say that for England it was a very dark time. So he was absolutely against the positive, the optimistic way of thinking of Condorcet. If you remember, in 1793, the mood of society was optimistic before the terror of Jacobin, Robespierre. But by 1798, it was replaced by reaction and pessimism. Public opinion has been changed because of Robespierre's reign of terror and by the threat of French invasion. So his work directly reply on that optimistic theories of Godwin and Condorcet. These thinkers, they predicted positive political reforms and progress of the human mind. Malthus analyzed the notion of perfectibility of Condorcet, but he says that it's only organic perfectibility, biological meaning of that. We can say that Condorcet, he never used this term in as organic perfectibility. It's word which were given to that concept by Malthus. So Malthus told that his thought was based on its natural character and inherent immanence of human nature. From Condorcet's perspective, the disappearance of poverty and excessive rich needs to happen is a natural way due to the development of science, technology, the art, and along with them, the morals, which ultimately will lead to an increase of human longevity. Next slide, please. Thank you. Malthus totally disagreed with the concluding observation of Condorcet, he indicting him a logical falsity. According to Malthus, the thesis about infinity of human amelioration has a non-scientific character. It's not supported by natural laws. He said it's absolutely impossible to, for example, have a normal flower or a normal food or something like that with a big size. It's not biologically possible. Could you please give me the next slide? Thank you. Then he was saying at the second place that effects of climate, effects of diets and other causes, they of course could change a bit species, but they could never, for example, species of flora, flowers, fruit plants cannot grow in size at infinitively, but just as a result of selection. However, Malthus himself could be reproached with the skewed nature of a way of thinking. He was, we can say that he was focusing on quantitative changes. He gives little weight to a qualitative transformation of organic nature. Following Condorcet, we can talk not only about increasing the size or volume of a fruit or flower, but about increasing of the duration of flowering plants, about the constant improvement of the taste and smell of fruits. Perhaps Condorcet was not as inconscient as it seemed to Malthus. Also, Malthus proposed to demarcate the idea of the endless of historical progress, and progress, the limits of which cannot be precisely defined, because he couldn't find any scientific reason in it. For him, the infinity, limitless, of progress lies in the actual lack of knowledge of the border, passing on which the improvement of the human species really takes place. On the contrary, Condorcet argued that by accumulating useful knowledge and not forgetting the lessons of the past, mankind is constantly pushing its limits. And if the process of learning has no limits, due to this, the progress is unstoppable. Condorcet was talking to us that we improve the science, and science every time change the limits. For example, about longevity, our life. We can, for now, we can live, I don't know, 80, 70 years. In time of Condorcet, we were living, people were living 40 years. We can see that limits were changed because of science, because of medicine, because of meanings of subsistence. So our science, Condorcet tells us, we will change the limits all the time. When speaking of the inerrance of Condorcet, Malthus pays regard to another thesis about infinite duration of human life, as I said. But he put it from Condorcet, he was atheistic, and he was talking about living of person, life of person in the earth. But for Malthus, who was a Christian priest, that position was absolutely alien. The immortality of human soul, of course, for him was a religious dogma that does not require proofs. But he couldn't say it about human body and life extension. It was not so important for him. And that is why he called the Condorcet's idea of infinite extension of human physical life on Earth the most absurd and curious. During his lifetime, Malthus had many also opponents. Of course, it's clear that his criticism of Condorcet gave even greater significance and relevance to the ideas of the French thinker. And we can see, then we can find several common moments in many philosophers, in many thinkers. But one for me is most important. I will tell you about words of the Russian physicist Sergei Kapitsa. Could you please change the slide? More than 2 centuries after Condorcet's death, Kapitsa shows a surprising shared understanding with his theory of progress, manifested above all in Kapitsa's controversy with Malthus. Next slide, please. Kapitsa was also a mathematician, and he was the first one. Many people, of course, they were talking that Malthusian trap is wrong, it's a lie, it's impossible to live like that, that our people grows in geometrical rate, our means of subsistence grows in arithmetical rate. But the only scientist who proved it, who proved that Condorcet was right and Malthus was wrong, was the Russian scientist Sergei Kapitsa. And he was a scientist of 20th century. So he wrote a work, which called Global Population Blow Up and After, the demographic imperative in a changing world. In this work, he claims that the population of the Earth will not increase exponentially, but by hyperbola. He says that on a semi-logarithmic plot grows up to the population explosion is hyperbolic, and when it approaches year 2000, it goes off to infinity. Accordingly, the theory of Malthus, progressive for its time, has now lost its relevance. We can say it, that we saw that population of Earth didn't increase in geometrical rate. And Kapitsa explained why. Malthus' approach and understanding of the world is directly related to the development of classical mechanics in the 18th century, and it corresponded to the mechanistic Newtonian methodology and views of the Enlightenment, as well as the views of physiocrats. At the present stage of development of society, science and technology, by only raising the global level of analysis, by overestimating the scale of the problem, considering the entire population of the world as a single object, and an interconnected system, was it possible to describe the development of humanity altogether? So Kapitsa proposes us to see the humanity altogether in all factors, in all meanings that is possible. In other words, Kapitsa considers it necessary to make an analysis in non-addictive and non-linear way, and to use the physics of non-linear phenomena and other processes that were developed in science in 20th century to estimate the phenomena described by Condorcet and Malthus. Analyzing the hyperbolic growth of humanity, he proposed to link the population growth with its development. So as many people we have, as smarter, we are. When development, he says, is the square of the world's population, believing that collective interaction is determined by the mechanism of distribution and reproduction of generalized information on a human scale. So the most important part in our society, it's an information, defining itself similar development. Therefore, the origin and nature of the quadratic law of human growth should be explained by the transmission and reproduction of information. The most important part in our growth of humanity, of population, it's a transmission and reproduction of information. There is no need to refer to a particular mechanism, in particular economic, which leads to an increase of numbers. It's not about economy, he says. It's about information and your mind. This follows from a consistent phenomenological analysis of the hyperbolic growth of the population of our planet. Could you please give me next slide? Thank you. Kapitsa refutes the thesis of Malthus about the endless increase in population exponentially, considering that population growth has not only the explosive nature of development along hyperbola, but also its limit. He says we couldn't grow without limits. I mean, as many people as we are. He calls this phenomenon the principle of the demographic imperative, according to which growth is determined by the internal processes of human development, unlikely the population principle of Malthus, according to which population growth is limited by external resources. Our growth is not limited by our external resources, but only about our internal development, internal perfectibility, as you want. This is a significant conclusion that has far-reaching consequences in determining the path of human development, since not quantitative growth, but its qualitative development is now becoming a central factor of our social evolution. So only our qualitative development provokes our social evolution. In other words, refuting Malthus' thesis on limiting population growth by external resources, Kapitsa confirms Condorcet's idea that internal development is a decisive factor of evolution of humanity. The internal development, improvement, is the quality, for example, of education, of medical services, development of social policy, which are based on the desire of mankind to improve their own abilities and create healthy environment. To describe the present and predict the future of humanity, it's necessary to fundamentally change the research method, point of view both in space and in time, and consider humanity from very beginning of its appeals as a global structure. Historicity, globality, and continuity. There are three fundamental principles that lie at the heart of this new method, according to Kapitsa. Next slide, please. Thank you. But after all, in essence, Condorcet writes the same thing. He was writing it in 18th century. This progress, he says, is governed by the same general laws, and as can be seen in the development of the faculties of individuals because of just the upshot resulta that individual development considered at once in many individuals united in society. That upshot is at any instant depends on the upshots at the preceding instance and the influence of future ones. So this picture is historical because it's a record of continual change based on the successive observation of human societies in the different eras they have gone through. Next slide, please. Thank you. Working on this subject, Kapitsa set himself two goals. On the one hand, he determined why human development and population growth should be associated not with external factors, like Malthus told us, but with internal ones. And on the other hand, to express this conclusion in the language of mathematical models and physical theories, which are based on the facts of history and basis concepts adopted in economic and social sciences. Analyzing in his works three models of human growth, linear, exponential, and hyperbolic, Kapitsa concludes that in the third one, that most accurately reflects the real state of affairs. At the end of anthropogenesis, the hyperbolic growth of the world's population began, and since then it has increased in direct proportion to the square of world's population up to our time. Slowly at the beginning, as the population grows, the growth rate increases. And as a result, it goes faster than exponentially, rushing to infinity at a finite time around 2025. So if we are talking about the theory of Kapitsa, we can see that the growth of population will not stop, but will not be so fast around 2024 year, so soon. The difference between the exponential and hyperbolic growth models lies in the fact that exponential growth implies only an individual ability to reproduce, to give a birth to children, independent to other people and external factors. Just we do as many children as we can or as we want. Hyperbolic growth occurs as the result of a collective mechanism of population multiplication, and it's associated with development of mankind, which in turn is subordinated to human consciousness, his culture, and advanced knowledge transfer system. Thus, Kapitsa's reasoning and conclusions are aligned to the Condorcet theory of progress. Condorcet told us, if we consider the same development's results for the mass of individuals living at one time in one region and follow it down through the generation, that give us the picture of the advances of the human mind. The next slide, please. Thank you. And again, we are talking about what for, what aims, what we are talking about. The idea of perfectibility described as a conductor, a goal, and at the same time as an instrument of progress of the human mind. It can be called very progressive and avant-garde for its time. And after talking about Kapitsa, I found that while I was doing my research, I found that that idea of perfectibility of Condorcet was embodied in the concept of transhumanism, the ideologues of which push forward to proclaim Condorcet as one of its spiritual mentors. Could you please change the slide? Transhumanism. Next slide, please. I like to use this notion of transhumanism. Of course, many of you know what is it, but I will just say several words about the concept. Transhumanism is a philosophical doctrine that analyzes and encourages the use of certain technologies to improve the human condition beyond the constraints of biological evolution. So what transhumanism is? It's a technical improvement of human body. It's a technical and scientific improvement of human soul, of moral qualities. There are many different steps. There are many different types of transhumanism. For example, you know, of course, biohacking, I don't know, brain on the flesh card, different research in artificial womb and ectogenesis, giving a birth in artificial womb. What else? Different things with artificial intelligence also. So artificial, it's a ideology which says you people, you can live forever. You can just change your body. You can change, I don't know, organs or parts of your body. You can improve your soul, your mental condition, your psychology, sorry. And as a person, you will live together always, but maybe in a strange way, in a technological way. Next slide, please. So that's why many transhumanists say that idea of perfectibility of Nicolas de Condorcet, it was the first idea of transhumanism. He was a forefather of transhumanism. So for me, it was a quite interesting question. Can we consider he like a real forefather of that modern ideology? The next slide, please. Thank you. For this perspective, Nick Bostrom, a Swedish philosopher and apologist of transhumanism and one of the founders of international organization Humanity Plus, he first called Condorcet one of the ideologists of the movement, believing that transhumanism is an extension of the humanistic tradition of the Enlightenment, which its idea of endless improvement of human individuals. So he said, really, transhumanism is a rational humanism, and Condorcet was one of the inventors of this idea. Next slide, please. Transhumanists believe that defined perfectibility is improving by real improvement of our moral, intellectual, physical faculties, as Condorcet said. He thought that way predicted the future in the human race, with tendencies to improve itself with assistance of transhumanist technologies. Next slide, please. And we can see that for the first regard, looks like that. At the first hand, the goals and objectives of improving the human race are similar to Condorcet and modern transhumanists. For example, the statue of Russian transhumanist movement has the following position. You can see it on your screen. With the help of science and modern technologies to develop an infinite personality, going beyond the limits of human capabilities that are now considered natural. Two key characteristics perfectibility in the Condorcet's interpretation, which are conscious improvement of human qualities and the absence of limits for this improvement are declared at this foundation as a foundation stone of transhumanism. Next slide. Of course, transhumanists, they like these words of Condorcet, but they like it because he was talking about real improvement of mankind. But I'm not sure that they like that part when he was talking about destruction of inequality and advances of inequality, so with individual nations. Calling SketchUp as possible scientific and technical program for improving human nature, we should not forget that idea of Condorcet has more likely social political substantiation, where the perfectibility, first of all, is a source of free will of each individual. The French philosopher, who is called the philosopher of freedom, he's not ready to sacrifice his own democratic concept of perfectibility for scientific and technological progress only, conceived as the embodiment of the key principles of enlightenment: freedom, equality, rationality, autonomy, humanity, and etc. Could you please give me the next slide? Thank you. So the most important part of his philosophy, of his thought, was destruction of the inequality. And we can say that in transhumanism, there is no destruction of inequality, because it's absolutely another thinking. If we will be all augmented people, I don't know, changed, if our bodies will be changed by technology, how we will receive the changes? We will have to pay, or we will have to receive it by our government. Maybe, it's my point, maybe transhumanism creates a real inequality between people and between classes of people. So that's why trying to interpret Condorcet's idea of perfectibility in the concept of transhumanism, we should not forget that while addressing the prospects of real human improvement, Condorcet means, first of all, the destruction of inequality between nations and the progress of equality between different classes of the people, thereby indicating that the social political side of perfectibility prevails on the scientific side. It's not only about extension of our life he was talking, but he was talking about destruction of the inequality, first of all. In summary, the concept of perfectibility as a symbol of as enlightenment, it's a distinctive characteristic and foundation of a human race, its ability to improve. Therefore, perfectibility to one degree or another becomes the fundamental category, not only of the theory of progress of each of the authors reviewed, but also the basis of understanding the genesis of transhumanism. Next slide, please. So we were talking about elimination of inequality, and Condorcet, one of the first French authors, one of the first French philosophers who was talking about equality, and he was questioning about this. Another important issue is equality, as I said, but it's equality of the rights of all citizens, and in particular gender and racial equality. He was one of the first who was talking about gender and racial equality in France in 18th century. An essay on giving women the rights of citizenship and sorts of slavery dealt with these topics. In 1989, when the French National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, that the same National Assembly rejected Condorcet's draft of declaration that he called Declaration of Rights. We need to understand. Could you please give me the next slide? Thank you. So he was likely to emphasize the equal value and significance of the document for all French citizens, regardless of gender and social status. The newly enacted declaration prohibited discrimination against the French citizens on the groups of class and religion, but completely ignored the rights of women. Later, that Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, became part of the first French Constitution in 1791, which enriched the so-called status of passive citizens to women. Passive citizens, it's the citizens who were deprived of the right to vote and to be elected. Women couldn't participate in elections anyway. During this period, Condorcet was the one male politician who publicly criticized the new declaration because it didn't contain any reference to women's rights. As you know, Declaration of Human Rights, or Déclaration des droits de l'homme, can be translated from French as either Declaration of Human Rights or Declaration of the Rights of Man. The same in French. We can translate homme like human and like man, male human. So this caused the thinker to avoid such approach and give universal title for his own declaration. We can see it on our slide. He gave it name Declaration of the Rights. So he was thinking to tell to you, his compatriots, that it's declaration of the rights of all people, all citizens in France at that time. Next slide, please. Thank you. However, Condorcet was not the only public person who was concerned about the issue of equality of rights between men and women. He was the first and the only, at the time, the only man who was thinking about it, yes. But in 1791, the notable female journalist, writer, and the first French feminist, Olympe de Gouges, published her own draft. And that draft was called, as you see, Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. According to this text, she demanded that women enjoyed the same status of active citizens as men, proclaiming equality of natural rights and freedoms for all members of society, regardless of sex. Next slide, please. But the situation in France at that time was not as optimist as they wanted to see it. Although the church influence on society was declining due to the development of the Enlightenment ideas, but many secular misogynistic ideas blossomed. Not only were women's civil rights questioned, but also their intellectual and physical ability comparing to men. From a political point of view, women were considered inferior to men in terms of status and did not have any political rights. Later, the Napoleonic Civil Code, you can see it here, reinforced this injustice by depriving of civil rights married women, putting them into the same category as minors, criminals, and insane persons in terms of rights. So married women had the same rights like criminals, for example, and insane persons. When getting married, a woman was forced to waive all her legal rights. She couldn't choose her place of resistance or do something with property without the written consent of her husband, and she has to obey him unconditionally. Also, married women were under the obligation to commit to their marital duties, so-called engaging in sexual intercourse regardless of whether they consented to it or not. And violence from their husbands, so also including sexual violence, it was not officially considered a crime. A wife's unfaithfulness was punished more severely than a husband's unfaithfulness because she could give a birth to a illegitimate child, bastard. And even after the death of her husband, the wife has not restored her rights. She couldn't be a legal representative of her children, and she couldn't manage an estate. Her legal and political disability was absolutely. So Olympe de Gouges was one of the few women who fought against such practices and laws. Next slide, please. Thank you. Her declaration of the rights of the woman and of the female citizen became a kind of manifesto that proclaims feminism as the basic principle of political governance and the guarantee of state prosperity. She told, as long as nothing is done to uplift the souls of women, as long as they do not help make themselves more useful, more consistent, until the men are old enough to take care of their true glory seriously, the state cannot prosper. Next slide, please. Thank you. De Gouges points out the hypocrisy of the revolutionary policy of the state, as it does not lead to the true equality that it claims to reach, because in the first version of the declaration, it was written that all citizens are equal, but in a real situation, it was not like that. She proclaimed its well-known statement, a woman has the right to mount on scaffold. She must also have the right to mount the speaker's rostrum. She deplored that while women are denied rights, they are still liable to punishment should not they obey the law. Both Olympe de Gouges and Nicolas de Condorcet argue that it's unfair that women are subject to rules that were adopted by men. For such rules disregard the needs, the desires, and options of women. Condorcet points out that laws are written by men and for men, and yet the interests of men and women differed significantly, causing these laws to discriminate against women. Condorcet, within the framework of its political activities, strove the end of injustice and addressed gender inequality to many of his works. We were talking about 5 members on public education, on the admission of women to the rights of citizenship, but interesting thought he wrote in Letters from a Freeman of New Haven to a Citizen of Virginia. Next slide, please. Condorcet regarded the concept of natural rights as absolute for every rational human being. It was something new at the time. He told that every rational human being has natural rights. In his opinion, women are rational human beings as well, and they have rights from birth and should not be deprived of these rights under any circumstances. These rights, he said, are called natural because they derive from the nature of man, because it's a clear and necessary consequence of a very fact that it's a sentient being capable of reason and moral ideas exists, then he must enjoy these rights and could not justify be deprived of them. Condorcet's civil rights result directly from natural rights. In this respect, the philosopher claims that the state engineering the deprivation of the rights of half of humanity. He told about 12 million women. It couldn't definitely be considered as free or just. A state in which some of the inhabitants, or at least some of the landowners, are deprived of these rights, cease to be free, it's no longer a true republic. And having said this, it's also true to say that no true republic has ever existed. A real republic, according to the philosopher, should be based on the principles of reason, equality, and justice. In this respect, there is no reason to deny women the realization of their rights. Next slide, please. Also, he assessed that gender equality derives from the existence of reason and morality in every individual. If we agree that men have rights simply by virtue of being capable of reason and moral ideas, the women should have precisely the same rights. Yet never in any so-called free constitution have women had the right of citizenship. Another way, both women and men are sensible beings and moral agents. That is important too, with reason and moral ideas. In this regard, they equally have natural rights, and by extension, civil and political rights, and not only by birthright. According to Condorcet, introducing the concept of women incapacity into the French law, it's oppressive, and it increases injustice and inequality in society. Next slide, please. Thank you. Using sarcasm, Condorcet wonders why the idea of male monarch is so familiar for his citizens, while the idea of female citizen is so unacceptable. He used we can see here, he used an example of Elizabeth of England, Maria Theresa, and two Catherines of Russia. He was asking the question, why in Paris woman can be owner of a shop of dress, but she couldn't, for example, go and vote for the candidate that she likes. So thereby, not only does Condorcet stand up for women's active electoral rights, but also passive electoral rights, namely the right to be elected and to hold public positions like men. That was absolutely unexpected. Through all his work, Condorcet addresses the purported female inferiority, inability to make decisions and participate in political and economic life due to particular features of the female body or motherhood consequences, such as pregnancy, bearing, and breastfeeding. Condorcet consistently rejects that argument. He says, the female constitution means that they would make unsuitable soldiers, and for some of their lives debars them from posts which require hard work on a daily basis. Pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding would prevent them from fulfilling these functions. But I believe that all other differences between men and women are simply the result of education, And here we're coming back to his concept of education for everyone, for men and women. It's the most important part of his philosophy, his concept. So it's not about physical and mental disability of women, as many believed at the time, but from the lack of proper education. And that is why all people, regardless of gender, should have access to full-fledged education. And it's the only way to enable people to become real citizens. Next slide, please. Could you please change the slide? I need the next one. Thank you. Equal access to education for both men and women is one of the most prominent natural rights listed in the Condorcet's Declaration of Rights. Its adoption, according to the philosopher, is another step to the path of humanity to progress through education, since only the setting up of a fair legislative system together with objective general education will allow citizens developing their knowledges, exercising their rights, and assessing the consequences of these rights. And all of this should lead to the progress of society. The idea of freedom for both men and women becomes undoubtedly the central and the most democratic idea of his declaration. It doesn't boil down to political freedom, but also includes the freedom of man and citizen as freedom of movement, freedom of religious beliefs, etc. The main objectives of his declarations of rights are follows. First, restrict states' nuisance in relation to the rights and freedom of citizens. Second, identify the possible threats to these rights and freedoms. And third, create a robust legal structure. Like all his system, he wanted it to be protected by law. This should become the basis of the entire system of constitutional law and foster the framework of an advanced social and state system, define the foundation of new legal order on the way to general progress of society. Next slide, please. Thank you. The objectives of the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen of Olympe de Gouges, they are less ambitious and fundamental, but not less important. Of course, because she was not a philosopher, we can say, but she was a very brave woman who fought for her ideas. According to this text, to her declaration, all women living in France are equal in their absence of rights in relation to men. Therefore, the French feminists elected to fight against it, relying on the principle of full civil equality between genders, as well as the laws of nature and reason. Next slide, please. Thank you. According to her, natural and sacred rights of women are following: liberty, property, security, and especially resistance to oppression, as well as a freedom of speech and control over one's own life. The basis of state should be the union of man and a woman, created in accordance with the laws of nature and reason, as the laws of reason are wise and the laws of nature are divine. So eventually, this union receives the blessing of both, of supreme being. She was talking about God, but she used these words, supreme being and the state. Yet by union, the Gouges does not mean to allude the traditional patriarchal marriage that she refers as a tomb of confidence and love. Rejecting the traditional form of marriage, she proposed a social contract between man and a woman, which will become the prototype of the civil solidarity pact between two adults for organizing their shared life. Now in France, they have the pacts. This social contract includes the joint management of the partners' common property, mutual custody of the children, the obligation to provide for them, as well as sanctions in case of refusal to recognize their own child. Also, another key aspect of her program was to require the end of forced marriages, legitimize the rights of illegitimate children, and the fight against their stigmatization. Also, in her declarations, she supports of citizens, direct and indirect. Both women and men, they have the same quality, possibility to have rights. Also, she was talking about, as Condorcet, she was talking about free education, public education for girls. That was important, and women, and the main factor of their intellectual enhancement and enlightenment. So the state has to guarantee that an educated woman has the same share in the distribution of positions, employment, offices, honors, and jobs. She was talking not about only education, but about the possibility to work for women, which was absolutely impossible at that time. For both that two persons, Nicolas de Condorcet and Olympe de Gouges, the natural rights of women and their perfectibility were beyond any doubt. They were first in their time who developed the idea of society should see a woman in a new way, as a free, reasonable, educated person, and not as a second-class being whose main tasks would be to give a birth, do housekeeping, and satisfy sexual needs of men. Therefore, both of them can rightly be called pioneers, visionaries, and heroes who were ahead of their time and were discriminated against due to their beliefs. Next slide, please. And next. Thank you. Despite all their efforts, unfortunately, the idea of equality between men and women in France disregarded for almost 2 centuries. I cannot say that they forgot about it, but it was not important. Adopted in 1804, the Napoleonic Code consolidated for a long time the inequality and subordination of women. The rights for which Condorcet and de Gouges fought at the end of 19th century were given to French women much later than many other European women. The right to vote and participate in elections, for example, was granted to French women in 1944. The right to work without the consent of their husband in 1965. The right to have an abortion by their own will in 1975. In 1999, PACS, as I said, Civil Solidarity Pact between partners, was introduced in French law. It happened more than 2 centuries after the death of Olympe de Gouges on the guillotine. The distinction between legal or illegal and legal and illegal child, for example, filiation légitime and filiation naturelle, was removed from French law just at the beginning of 21st century. Next slide, please. So we can say all these persons, they were fighting for their own important things. It was not for nothing. They were considering the notion of progress as something optimistic. And now I can say that we need this optimistic view of progress. We need to believe that everything will be okay, especially in our dark and difficult situation. Finishing my presentation, I just want to say several words several topics and conclusions that we were talking while my speech. The first, I was talking about Nicolas de Condorcet's idea of progress and his system of progress, which includes education and science and law, and about perfectibility as the main force which drives persons, human beings, and human societies to positive progress, to our positive future. First, I was talking about perfect notion of perfectibility at conception of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, French philosopher. The second, who invented, but he gave to that thought a negative connotation. Then I was talking about Thomas Malthus and his Malthusian trap, about his critics of idea of organic or biological perfectibility of Condorcet. Then I was talking about criticism of ideas of Malthus, which were given by Sergei Kapitsa, a Russian and Soviet philosopher and scientist. And the last point, I was talking about feminism, ideas of feminism, ideas of fight for essential rights of human beings, with Nicolas de Condorcet and also Olympe de Gouges. For that, I would like to say thank you very much. And could you please put the last slide? Thank you very much for your attention. And I would love to be happy if you give me any feedback on my email or give your impressions. Thank you very much. Marina, I haven't heard of the work of this author, and it doesn't seem to be very popular today. It's true. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that the theory of historical progress of the mind could have influenced ideas of social evolutionism. Yes, as a social Darwinism. If there is some evidence, yes, this is true. If it's what criticism would you make the concept of progress from anti-Darwinist perspective? Doesn't the idea of infinite improvement fit in with this? Sorry, I didn't finish. Thank you very much for that question. You are right, absolutely. I just didn't include Darwin in my presentation because I don't have so much time. But you're absolutely right that Darwin, he was influenced by Thomas Malthus, because he took his idea of, for example, fight for existence from the work of Malthus. And he took many ideas. And he was talking also, Darwin doesn't use the word perfectibility, but he was talking about this conception. He was on the side of Malthus. Condorcet says that he was talking about counter-arguments, which you're asking about. Condorcet told us that the conception of progress is very optimistic, not because it lies only on biology, but because it lies in our improvement of our moral qualities and in our reason. So that's why social Darwinism in conception of Condorcet, of course, he didn't use this word, but he believed in moral perfectibility, that he was talking that we will improve our physical capacities, our psychological capacities, and our moral capacities. And it will bring us to a happy, optimistic future where we wouldn't need social Darwinism or something like that. So he believed in human beings. He believed in people very much. I hope I answered your question. If there are no other questions, Alejandro, could you please tell me we are finishing, or maybe you have any questions? finished. Thank you very much. So I would like to say goodbye. I would like to say thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write me on my email.